Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Don Jeffries about his book, Hidden History, an Exposé of Modern Crimes, Conspiracies, and Cover-Ups in American Politics. He is also the author of The Unreals. You can follow his work on the Keeping It Unreal blog at donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. You can find him on Facebook under Donald Jeffries and on Twitter at Don Jeffries. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/hidden-history. Don, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, first, I'd like you to give us a brief overview of your book. What's in it, how is it set up, and what do you hope to accomplish by writing it?
Well, the original subtitle of the book was actually an encyclopedia of crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups, and I think a lot of people have said it does read like an encyclopedia. I tried to cover just about every significant incident and topic that has come up in the 50 years at the time I wrote it since the Kennedy assassination. I started it from the Kennedy assassination, 1963, and basically the 50 years that followed, and I wanted to delineate what I think is just kind of an uninterrupted timeline of crimes, corruptions, and conspiracy during that time. And I think people have seen that these things are connected. A lot of people try to look at the JFK assassination or 9/11 or whatever in a vacuum. And these things don't happen in a vacuum. There are connections because they display what is, really, as I said, organized corruption on the part of whoever is in charge at that time. And they simply replace themselves. The names change, but the behavior doesn't. And you can see any of the incidents in there, you'll see the unnatural deaths, the missing evidence, the cover-ups, and the absurd official stories that fall apart with the least bit of investigation. And the fact that our mainstream media doesn't do any investigating unless it's to go after people like me, the people that are questioning it, shows you exactly why they keep being successful in putting out these false narratives.
Sure. Now, in the subtitle of your book, you use the word conspiracies, and a lot of the topics, not all of them by any means, because there's so many topics in this book, it's really an impressive list, but a significant number of the topics you cover in this book are associated with conspiracy theories the second they're brought up. So what is a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory, and why shouldn't they be the taboo and off-limit subjects that they often are considered to be in quote-unquote respectable society?
Well, conspiracy theory has become it's kind of a catch-all term and a smear label on people who question authority or are skeptical about anything. Like I've told people, if they read my book, if they can find a theory in it, let me know what it is, because I don't have a theory. I'm just showing that whether it's the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, 9/11, Waco, Vince Foster, you name it, anything that I cover in my book. If you look at the official story, what you're sold, what you're told happened by our leaders and by the mainstream media, it falls apart completely. And whatever happened, it isn't what they're telling you. So I don't think that's a conspiracy theory, but in the eyes of the mainstream media, it is. And that's how they try to denigrate people. I mean, it's very little different than when they used to call people commies and pinkos back in the 1950s. It's just questioning authority. It's being skeptical.
Now, I imagine, having studied conspiracy theories for a while, you have a pretty good meter to determine when the official story is baloney. So what are some of the kind of general lessons that you've learned from studying these through the years, and how good do you think your BS meter is?
Well, yeah, I think my BS meter is finely tuned at this point. I just turned 60, so I've been around quite a while, and I've learned to look for the same things, in all of these stories. And basically, I've become extremely cynical about it, especially since Sandy Hook and the Boston bombing and incidents like that, where I tend to just, if it's a story that is covered extensively by the mainstream media, I just assume it's, complete disinformation. And I think, there's not one really big incident that I looked at and did any investigation at all where I said, they got it right. What we're told in the official history books, that's what happened. It just isn't. And there's always unanswered questions. There's always witnesses who, weren't questioned or said something completely different. The ballistics don't add up if it's a murder. It's the same thing over and over again. And so, yeah, you can't help but have it's not even a BS meter at this point. It's something where I expect, like, if something ever happened that was covered extensively by the media and I looked at it and it added up, I would be shocked, because it never has, at least anything that I've investigated so far.
Well, it's really sad, the state of the mainstream media, and of course they're by and large not journalists. There are some reputable and true journalists in the mainstream media, but by and large they don't engage in the type of hard-hitting investigative journalism, asking all the questions, trying to get to the bottom of everything that many of us would probably like to see from them. Why is that? Why is the mainstream media not full of hard-hitting and true journalists? And when did this start? Has this always been the case in American history, or is this a relatively new phenomenon?
Well, I think it's gotten a lot worse, but I'm writing Hidden History 2 now, which is pre-1963 crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups. There's plenty of them, too. And you find the same things. It's just not as blatant now, because I think with the birth of the Internet, that's when things really started to change and opened a lot of people's eyes, especially young people, because we got to see now, because you can study these events in real time. Something like Sandy Hook or the Boston bombing or any of these recent multitude of shootings that seem to happen every day, alleged terrorist events. In real time, you'll see people from their parents' basements put up impressive videos, real investigative work. They're the real journalists out there. These are citizen journalists, whereas the mainstream media is worse than really Pravda and TASS were in the Soviet Union at their height. Because at least back then, as somebody told me in a recent interview, the Soviet Union, the people there they knew they were a joke. They knew they were being lied to. Too many Americans don't know they're being lied to. They swallow these ridiculous stories, whether it's the single bullet theory or the magic passport floating down after 9/11 or the giant magic fertilizer bomb at Oklahoma City. I mean, they accept these things over and over again. And they do so because they trust blindly in whoever is telling them about it on television. And none of those people, as you said, it pretty much has been that way, I think, for a long time. But at least, 100 years ago, I think you had some muckraking journalists, and it certainly wasn't as bad as it is now. Now you have nothing outside of, again, the journalists on the Internet and maybe Russia Today and some things like Breitbart will tell the truth about the Democrats, and you may have somebody on the left, Mother Jones or something, that may tell the truth about some of the Republicans, but nobody puts it all together. And that's, my book is not biased to the left or right at all. I'm a populist, and I pretty much think they're all corrupt.
So let's take some time and jump through some of the topics covered in the book. One topic that's talked about a lot when it comes to conspiracy theories, and you mentioned it briefly, was the JFK assassination. So what can you tell us about the JFK assassination, and what can you tell us that maybe our readers who are somewhat familiar with conspiracy theories, what can you tell us that they might not know?
Well, the JFK assassination, I call it the mother of all conspiracies, and it's what got me involved. As a teenager, I started reading the books on the Kennedy assassination written by the critics back then, and I saw instantly, boy, this is just impossible. There's no way that Lee Harvey Oswald, this guy, did it. But most people don't realize that the crime has never been investigated. And we talk about the news media again. NBC News at the time, in 1963, people got all their news from the big three television networks. One of those networks we have, and I put it in my book, there is a record, a paper trail of the NBC News agreeing to broadcast only those evidence that is consonant with the FBI findings on the assassination. So in the beginning, they agreed to just pass along this information from the FBI. And again, none of these guys, and that's why the ones that are still surviving, the Dan Rathers, who got a start during the Kennedy assassination as a local Dallas reporter, they're so betrothed to this single assassin theory because they put out such disinformation. At the very least, they were lazy and didn't do any reporting, so they have a vested interest in it, as do the reporters down the line, whether it's 9/11, whatever else. They have a vested interest in these official stories, so they're going to smear anybody that questions them, like me, as a conspiracy theorist. But I would tell people to look at, there's so many key pieces of evidence in the Kennedy assassination, but the November 25th, 1963 memorandum from Assistant Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach to Bill Moyers, who was an aide to LBJ and then later became a PBS journalist. It delineates the fact, and they tell you they're not going to investigate the crime. And I put the excerpts from it in my book, but it basically says the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he had no Confederates at large, and all speculation about his motivation ought to be cut off. Now, this is in an official government memo. It was written basically within hours of Lee Harvey Oswald being killed by Jack Ruby. So instead, what one would expect to see from an honest government, an honest Justice Department official, would be we can't leave any stone unturned. Now that the suspect has been killed by this shady mobster nightclub operator, we have to really get to the bottom of this. What was the connection between them, and, were there others? But we didn't see that. Instead, immediately, they clamped down and said, we're not going to investigate. So I would urge everyone just to consider that the crime has never been investigated. The sitting president of the United States was assassinated in broad daylight in the main city, and no one ever investigated it. So this is what we face at this point, is that and it left such a bad taste in people's mouths. And I think it led to what we saw in the rest of the 1960s. Like I've said many times, I don't think Robert F. Kennedy and probably Martin Luther King, I don't think they would have been assassinated if John F. Kennedy hadn't have been. But again, no one ever investigated it, and certainly the mainstream media didn't.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on any one issue because there's so many, and I want to give our listeners a full taste, or at least a pretty solid taste of just how extensive the sorts of topics are you cover in this book. But because the JFK assassination is sort of the holy grail of conspiracy theories, I do want to ask you, if you had to point to the main reasons you would say to suggest that the official story is wrong on this, what would it be? Besides just some very suspicious acts on the part of the FBI or on the part of the Johnson administration or on the part of the media, if you had to make like a big three or big four, okay, these are reasons why I can say I can say and feel pretty confident that the official story is wrong. What would you point to for those three or four main reasons?
Okay, well, first of all, the person they pinned the crime on, Lee Harvey Oswald, had no motive. Every indication is that he rather liked John F. Kennedy. Everyone has talked about it. He had no means. He was a rather poor shot, in the words of the Marines themselves. The last time he was tested, he barely made the final third grade by 1 point. So he was a rather poor shot in their own words, and there's no evidence that he ever practiced again before shooting the president years later. He was using a defective weapon that had a defective scope. It had to be repaired before genuine experts would test fire the weapon. And even after being repaired, they still could never, no one has ever duplicated Oswald's feat of getting off 3 shots in 6.5 seconds with 2 hits. Their entire case rests on the single bullet theory, which I'm sure most people have heard of. But all you have to do is look at and I've been to the National Archives. I've held the rifle in my hand. I held the magic bullet. I've seen the bullet holes firsthand. The bullet holes in JFK's coat and his shirt are about 5.5 to 6 inches down below on his back. That matches exactly where it was on the autopsy face sheet, the original autopsy face sheet, which we were later told was mistaken, and also matches the description in the FBI report of Siebert and O'Neill, and also where it was on the death certificate by Admiral Berkeley, the JFK's personal physician. Clearly that back wound was about 5.5, 6 inches down below. For the official narrative to hold up, for there to be one assassin because the rifle couldn't fire fast enough otherwise, that bullet had to enter where it did 5.5, 6 inches down below from 6 floors above and behind, and somehow come out of JFK's throat without hitting any bone, because it came out in perfect condition, and then go on into Governor Connolly, who was in front of him, and caused 7 wounds total in both men, including the shattering of Connolly's wrist, one of the thickest wounds in the human body. I invite anybody to look at the Warren Commission's record, and you'll see the same test ammunition fired into the wrist of a human cadaver is completely smashed, and the bullet that came out, Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet, looks almost completely undamaged and looks identical to the bullet they, again, in their own exhibits, that was fired into cotton wadding, which I think that's probably what it was, fired into cotton wadding and planted in order to incriminate Oswald. So it's just impossible. The single bullet theory is impossible, and Oswald did not have the skill at any rate. He didn't have the motive. As Chief Curry of the Dallas Police said himself, no one has ever put Oswald on this. We can't put him on the 6th floor, which is where the shot supposedly came from. And again, that's not even, to me, that's the biggest evidence. The single bullet theory is impossible, and their entire case rests. And also, anybody who's seen the Zapruder film sees JFK's head going backwards with violent, motion, and that defies the law of physics to say that he was hit from behind in the head. And we all know the equal and opposite reaction. Well, it wouldn't be an equal and opposite reaction if the head flew backwards towards where the shot was coming from. So I think anybody who watches the Zapruder film, whether it was altered or not, and there's a whole school of thought that said it was altered, but the Zapruder film we have clearly shows, a little kid can see it. The first time I saw it, I said, oh, well, clearly he was shot from the front. So these are things that there's the official story rests on nothing. There was no investigation done. And if anybody reads my book, I tried to distill all the important arguments for conspiracy into about 70 pages or whatever it was. But I've been researching it for a very long time, and there is absolutely it's absolutely impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have assassinated JFK. Whoever else did, it wasn't him or any other one individual.
All right, and of course, in addition to the JFK assassination, you cover a lot of other topics related to the Kennedy family. You cover the RFK assassination, the death of John F. Kennedy Jr., and the Chappaquiddick incident involving Ted Kennedy, amongst others. But focusing on those three incidents in particular, the RFK assassination, Chappaquiddick, and JFK Jr.'s death, what does the official story get wrong on those incidents, and what does it maybe get right?
Well, and again, I don't think any of those incidents would have happened if JFK hadn't been assassinated. So again, if nothing else is tied, those Kennedy murders are directly tied, in my mind, because they understand the people, whoever killed JFK, they understand that these things that blood is thicker than water. And as I found out I was the first person to investigate JFK Jr.'s death independently. And I found out, as readers will find if they read it, that JFK had a quest to find out who killed his father. Behind the scenes, he was obsessed with his father's death. He was about to enter politics. There's no question that they killed him. Robert F. Kennedy was going to be president in 1968. I don't think there's any doubt about that. After he won the California primary, all you need to know about that is the official autopsy report from Thomas Noguchi, who they later tried to force out of office because of his findings, showed that there were powder burns behind Kennedy's right ear, and that the shot had to be almost point blank from behind that killed him. Well, the problem is every witness in that pantry that night placed Sirhan in front of them and no closer than 5 feet. So there had to have been a second gun, because in that case we know Sirhan was firing wildly before he was subdued on a table and the gun taken away from him. But, and I explain all the details in the book. There are too many bullet holes, too many bullet wounds. Again, the ballistics don't add up, and all you need to know again is the fact the fatal shot came from behind when Sirhan was in front. Chappaquiddick, I think, was Ted Kennedy's political assassination. It served the same purpose. After it happened, he was never going to be president. It killed his chances of being president. I don't believe he was in the car. Unlike most people, I do not believe for a second that he was driving the car that night that went into Pucha Pond off Nagasette Bay with Mary Jo Kopechne in the car, and of course she tragically drowned. I describe everything again in the book. I think he didn't even know what happened until the next morning when they came and told him, your car's in the pond and the dead girl's inside, because witnesses were there. He was acting normal until his cousin and another witness came up and told him. Then he turned pale, as white as a sheet, and they ran off. So again, these things are and I would say, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has my book and has the same publisher as me, I would hope he would ever contact me. I'd love to know what he thinks of it. But I would suggest if he tries to enter politics, that unfortunately he may suffer the same fate. I hope not. But again, the people that killed, and the Kennedy part of this is that they understand that blood is thicker than water. And any of these big stories, whether it's any of the Kennedy assassinations, 9/11, these huge stories that transformed our society, and all these things did, if the blanket of secrecy and the official story is proven wrong in any of these, it starts to bring down everything. Because all this house of cards that our leaders have built is built upon these absurd narratives, and it's their corruption. They're trying to hide their corruption desperately, and they're not hiding it from people like us. But unfortunately, because too many people are still asleep, if any of these official narratives are destroyed, where they can see them on television and the people they trust say it, then the whole thing comes crumbling down. So they fear someone like a Kennedy because the Kennedys are still glamorous and still supported by it. So if any of these guys get into office and start, just imagine, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., running for president and starting to talk about, the deaths of his uncle and his father and his cousin. I mean, that would be mind-blowing, but so I think they would do everything they could to stop that.
Well, and one of the themes that connects the official stories on the RFK and JFK assassinations is this idea that it was just one individual, this so-called lone nut theory in both of those instances. And then, of course, we've also seen this lone nut theory pop up in other places, with Martin Luther King being assassinated and with attempted assassinations on George Wallace and Ronald Reagan. Yeah. So why does this lone nut theory keep popping up? And is it any more valid in regards to Martin Luther King, George Wallace, and Ronald Reagan than it is in regards to John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy?
No, I don't think so. In each of those cases, as I show in the book, I don't think any of those individuals were guilty. Instead, other than Sirhan was firing a gun, but and Bremer, I haven't studied that enough to know, but Bremer certainly had a dubious background. So I think he was certainly not acting on his own behest. But America has a curious tendency, and our historians are as bad as our mainstream media is, because they push this narrative constantly that American politicians are never killed for political reasons. And this is, they've branded this in the public mind. When they see something happen, they think it's a nut, someone with psychological problems, and they even get people to believe, like, Oswald, for instance, his motivation, according to them, was that he wanted to be a man. He wanted to prove himself. Well, then why would you consistently claim he didn't do it? Same thing with Sirhan. They claim he wanted to prove he was somebody, but, he adamantly over and over again said, I don't remember doing it. That's been his story. And most people think he was actually a Manchurian candidate type that was really doesn't remember what he was doing. James Earl Ray, again, constantly tried to get a new trial for a long time, but the theme is that they're wanting to prove they're somebodies, and the other theme from the historians is that Americans just can't accept that a huge, this big, powerful leader could be brought down by a nobody. And this is, they can't accept that. They have to look for bigger meaning and a conspiracy, and that's simply not true. They're just thinking rationally and realizing, okay, if a political leader is shot, odds are it's going to be for political reason, especially in a family like the Kennedys, who they just keep dying in these unnatural ways. Like, you'd have to be a complete unthinking individual to not question that. But this is what our historians do and what our mainstream media does. They push these simplistic explanations on it, and anything that deviates from that at all, that's a conspiracy theory. Oh, you're talking about the laws of physics with JFK's head, that's a conspiracy theory. The bullet hole is 5.5 inches too low to have exited from the throat, that's a conspiracy theory. So that's what you get. You get called a conspiracy theorist, and that's what I am by their definition. But like I said, I don't have a theory other than it's not really a theory; it's a reality that what they're selling us nonstop is disinformation.
Well, and of course, political leaders are killed in almost every other country in the world for political reasons.
Right.
So it would seem odd that the United States, with all its influence on the global stage, with its relatively large population, the third largest in the world, with this long line and long history of political leaders, it would seem odd that the U.S. would somehow be exempt from this, while just about every other significant country and just about every other country, period, is not.
Right. That's American exceptionalism, like everything else. But, yeah, it is, and it's just, again, I go into this more in hidden history, too. I don't know when that'll be published down the road, hopefully. But you can just see the hand of the historian everywhere, and I call them the court historians, and they're very much like they work in conjunction with, big-time scholars at our colleges, and certainly with mainstream media reporters, where they push this narrative. They are just totally unquestioning, and they accept it. It's always, they expect it to be a lone nut when any of these things happen. In fact, they would always look for that. They would always believe it. And anything that contradicts that, they just sweep under the rug, and then they just try to push. Because in most of these cases, that you'll have early on, in every one of these cases, early on, until the official narrative becomes set, you'll have questions. You'll have evidence that later contradicts the official story completely. but they'll just eventually forget them. They'll act as if those early, and they'll just say, well, early on in the confusion, mistakes are made and misinformation. Well, some of this information is incredibly detailed. You had people, for instance, in the JFK assassination, one of the most underreported things are the witnesses that saw a huge pool of blood on the pergola up by the grassy knoll where Abraham Zapruder was sitting. You have one guy that, I think it's kind of gross, but he supposedly reached down with his finger and tasted it to make sure it was blood, because some of the inferences have been that it was soda. But you have people talking about this, and that kind of stuff there's no investigation. It's just swept under the rug, and it's, these are the kind of things that happen in all these cases, and that's what my book is about. I focus on all these things. I try to show how this evidence, there was no reason to sweep it aside, especially when it contradicts the official findings. But in the thrust of pushing an official story, anything that deviates from it must have been mistaken, and that's what they eventually conclude. And these reporters, as I said before, I don't think they have to, go to a meeting at, for Central Conspiracy 101 every week and say, hey, don't talk about conspiracies, but they might as well. That's how sad it is, because if you watch them on television, I used to watch C-SPAN years ago when it was better, and before they really started to clamp down on alternative views, they used to let some stuff get through there on the air. And they used to have a morning roundtable discussion that used to be on every day, and I used to watch it quite a bit. And you'd have mainstream reporters from the left and right, this paradigm we're in that's, really the debate is so narrow. But anyhow, they would have both conservative and liberal journalists on there, and they would get callers constantly that would come through and talk about forbidden subjects. It would mention conspiracy-type things. And every time they would kind of nervously laugh and say, well, I've never believed in conspiracy theories. Every single one of them. I never saw one journalist that didn't respond that way. And I think you can, if you took a poll of all the mainstream journalists in the country, 99.9% of them, swallow all these official narratives and poo-poo any conspiracy theories. And that's the problem. I don't think they have to be told that. I think that they go through the colleges, and again, they have the court historians, they have the scholars that all buy into this. They're brainwashed into this. This is their way of thinking. By the time they reach their newspapers or their television stations, they're thoroughly indoctrinated into it. And they act just like their predecessors acted in every previous. They know what to do instinctively. They don't even have to be told. And that's the sad part of it, is that there's so few renegades among them that can think independently, that they act as if they're being instructed, and I don't really think they are. I think they're just brainwashed.
And it's interesting, too, because everyone knows that these politicians and the media, they all lie. We all know that. If you can look at all the different scandals that have been uncovered in just the past, 50 years, whether it be the Iran-Contra or Watergate, and it's extremely obvious that they try to subvert the truth and try to just blatantly lie. But then in those situations, oh, well, yes, of course they were lying. But in other situations, oh, no, the official story is absolutely the truth, and there's no way that they would be lying to us. So why do you think that is?
Right, well, again, I don't know why these mainstream people aren't confronted more by people like Trump or Bernie Sanders or something, because they are to some degree, but they have the public has got a 6% approval rating for the mainstream media at this point. Nobody trusts them, or at least they say they don't. But we have the same dichotomy there where the public has less than a 10% approval rating for Congress, and yet 96% of the incumbents get reelected every year. I don't know how we explain that, but I think it's the same kind of thing with the mainstream media, where the public in poll after poll doesn't like them, doesn't trust them, and yet still the majority of the people turn on their television, and if Rachel Maddow or Bill O'Reilly, whatever they're saying, if they said the same thing I'm saying, they would believe it. And they're just completely trusting on whoever they trust. It's not quite as bad as it was when Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather, people like that were selling the news every night and doing a better job of it as far as selling it than the people we have now. But at this point, the news media, especially during this last presidential campaign, they have not even attempted, they don't even attempt to hide the fact that they're biased. They're cheerleaders for the state. They know they are. Right now they're trying desperately to get Hillary Clinton elected. They all might as well be wearing Clinton campaign hats. I mean, it's so obvious, and the public knows it. They know the public know it, but they're just that arrogant that they just don't care. Because what do we do about it? Because there's no one can break through that wall, or at least not enough people can break through the wall of the mainstream media. All we can do is construct, like Alex Jones and some other people say, make your own media, and that's what a lot of people have done, whether it's him or We Are Change with Luke Rakowski. There's and so many podcasts like yours where we are making our own media, and we're getting out to more and more people. But the problem is the majority still are buying into this dinosaur media, and there's too many of them are still swallowing the same empty political rhetoric, and they're just accepting of stuff. Too many of them are still ready to go to war. We've already been at war in our nation's history 93% of the time by most people's estimates. So we're at war pretty much all the time somewhere, and yet people never get sick of it. Yet if you ask them individually, what do you think of war? I mean, nobody's going to say, yeah, it's a good idea, but we're at war all the time, and the majority always supports whatever war our leaders are trying to get us into, and thus we have the kind of economy we have. We have the war party, for the most part, between what I call the Republicrats, and they're always pushing the same thing, and the people keep buying it. And I don't know, short of revolution, how you can overturn it. I mean, there is, we are doing what we can, and certainly more and more people are listening to alternative thinkers, but I don't know when it's going to be where the tipping point is, where the vast majority of the sleeping sheeple finally wake up and say, this is ridiculous. Something has to be done.
All right, so before we wrap up, I want to get back to our rapid fire of moving through topics in your books. There are a handful that I still want to get to that we haven't talked about. And one of them Daniel briefly alluded to in that question he just asked, but that's Watergate. Where is the official story wrong on the Watergate issue? Well,
actually, what Watergate is, I think, has actually been overplayed. And I didn't go into it too much other than there's a huge unnatural death list associated with it. But if anything, I tried to show in the book where Watergate, I think, that's the one conspiracy that the establishment seems to swallow. It's really the only time our media worked the way it's supposed to work. That's when you saw Woodward and Bernstein. That's when you saw front pages on the stories on the Washington Post every day. But it was child's play compared to the other conspiracies and all the corruption I try to expose in this book. Nixon actually comes off better than almost all the presidents in this book. And I believe, like Len Kolodny and other people said, I believe Watergate was actually a conspiracy engineered to remove Nixon from office for whatever reason. I don't think he was a great guy, but I think it's obvious that somebody wanted him out because you can tell just by the way the press and our institutions responded. They acted the way they should act, and they never do at any other time. They actually went after him aggressively or on really little. It was a break into the Democratic National Headquarters, and really penny-ante cover-ups compared to all the other. And certainly these are the same people that believe the JFK assassination, the single. They have no interest there. They had no interest in the RFK assassination. Later, they'd have no interest in 9/11 or anything else. But in this case, and the same people like Ben Bradley ran the Washington Post then, and he always pushed the lone assassin nonsense with JFK. And we later found out, he grew up as childhood friends with Richard Helms. They used to play together all the time. He became a big CIA honcho. And you see these kind of connections between our leaders all the time. But Watergate, in my mind, was child's play compared to virtually anything else I cover in the book.
All right. And another topic you cover in the book that is of particular interest to me. For some reason, I've just found it interesting because the whole thing was just so odd. But Ross Perot's campaign for president, particularly his 1992 campaign, but his 96 one to a lesser degree. In 1992, he ran and he was doing very well, and he was in first place in some of the polls. And then all of a sudden, he dropped out and claimed that Republican operatives were threatening to sabotage his daughter's wedding. And then a few months later, he got back in. The whole thing seems very strange. What do you have to say about the Ross Perot phenomenon in your book?
Yeah, I mean I do mention it in there, and I voted for Ross Perot both times, and there were very many parallels to him in Trump's campaign. In both cases, you had a kind of a loose cannon billionaire who was saying things that no one else was saying, and Ross Perot was very anti-NAFTA, especially, and we see what a disaster NAFTA was. later, and he was also very big in the POW-MIA movement, which I also talk about in the book there. It's a huge scandal, so to cover up forever. Ross Perot was very big on that and trying to expose that. So the establishment had a lot of reason to hate him. You're right, it made no sense. He was number one in the polls, and then he mysteriously dropped out. And those of us who watched this for a long time, we say the same thing with Trump. We kind of expect these things. We assume that it's a psyop and that, that they're not sincere. But then he came back in the race and still kind of seemed sincere, and he ended up getting 19% of the vote. But there's no question him dropping out and then coming is what cost him the election. And then later in '96, he only got 8% of the vote, which is still good for a third-party candidate. And since then, Ross Perot's still alive, but I have not seen him interviewed. He's basically dropped down the memory hole. I find it fascinating. He used one of his favorite words he used all the time to see that this guy who was a huge figure in American politics in 1992 especially, especially now, you think they would be interviewing about what he thinks of Donald Trump because there's so many parallels to Donald. In both cases, this renegade billionaire thing. No, I've not seen a single interview with him. I don't know what he looks like after 20 years. I know he's gotten pretty old, but clearly something was going on. I don't believe for a second that he dropped out because his daughter, I go into that in the book about, what does he mean his daughter's, the wedding was threatened. What was going to happen? I mean, they were going to take her. I mean, it made no sense at all. And whatever happened, it certainly, again, wasn't the official story they were selling us.
In this election now, we have the Clinton family being shown quite prominently. What are some of the scandals that the Clintons have been involved with over the years, and how incriminating are they?
Well, I call my chapter on the Clintons in the book Conspiracy Central, and it really was. I mean, the Vince Foster murder all alone, I don't believe for a second it was a suicide. I go into that in detail. All you need to know about that is there was an official Secret Service memo, and you can find it, that describes the finding of Vince Foster's body in his car. Now, that contradicts every single aspect of the crime scene because the official story is he was found on the ground in Fort Marcy Park. Lots of other questions about it, about the gun and, the bullet wound and so forth, and with the body. But clearly the body was moved. That Secret Service memo, that should have been the impetus for, again, the Woodward and Bernstein types that exposed Watergate. Where were they on this issue? Instead, they call you a conspiracy theorist and get angry if you. When Donald Trump broached the subject of Vince Foster, they went nuts. Briefly, the media went crazy. The Clintons don't have to do it. The media does their talking for them. And there were so many scandals. The Clinton body count is so large, and there have been like 6 that have happened this year since Hillary Clinton. The guy that was supposed to testify before her, about her, that dropped a barbell on his throat while he was weightlifting and killed himself. The young guy that Julian Assange mentioned recently, the 27-year-old intern in D.C. that was shot, but there was no robbery. Shot and killed that was associated with the Democratic National Convention. The lawyer for Julian Assange that was hit by a train. I mean, these are like bad movie scripts, but they actually happen. And yeah, I call Hillary Clinton the queen of corruption, and they have more scandals tied to them and more weird stuff, from cattle share to where she turned like $1,000 into $200,000, some ridiculous amount, something that's impossible for anybody to do without insider information. So many scandals surrounding her, and all the way up to her emails and the Clinton Foundation stuff that we see today. But I think that title is aptly called Conspiracy Central when it comes to them.
Right. So what does the official narrative get wrong on the Ruby Ridge and Waco and Oklahoma City incidents, all of which happened, of course, during the Bill Clinton presidency?
Yeah, well, these are all important incidents. Ruby Ridge was, again, and they were all escalations of government authority and tyranny over the people. And Ruby Ridge, Randy Weaver, he was a racial separatist, not a supremacist like they like to say, but even if he was, they still had no call to do what they did. The government kept trying to use one of the many undercover agents to get him to sell them a sawed-off shotgun. They kept trying and trying. One of them befriended him. Eventually, he sold a sawed-off shotgun very reluctantly. That was like 1/4 of an inch too short or something. They went after him like he was a third world nation, and they ended up attacking him with a Gestapo-style attack on his little, what they called a compound, but his little cabin up in the mountains. and they ended up blowing his wife's head off while she was holding her baby. And the FBI sharpshooter Len Horahuchi, who did that, remains unpunished. Is presumably still working. And then they went and taunted the family after, and they also killed his son, his only son. They shot him in the back when he was running away from, after he shot at them because they shot and killed his dog. So they shot and killed the 14-year-old boy when he was running away from him. Then they taunted the remaining daughters and family members for a few days by calling out the mother's name when they knew they had killed her. It's just, this stuff, it just breaks your heart when you read about what some of these things that our government did. In Oklahoma City, Waco, obviously, was the impetus for with so much discord in the nation, because you had, again, these group of religious extremists, they were called, but I mean certainly they were unusual people, the Branch Davidians, but as far as we know, they never harmed anybody. If anyone did, it was David Koresh, their so-called cult leader. He was seen in town all the time. Everyone knew him. They could have confronted him at any time and arrested him, but they went for a big public relations move. Especially the BATF went in there with tanks, armored tanks, and just overkill beyond belief. Attacked the media keeps calling it a compound. It's where the group lived. They chose to live together, and they have the right to do that in America, or should have anyhow. They attacked the place where they lived, and they ended up, obviously, after a 38-day siege or whatever it was, 40, can't remember how many days, 51-day siege, I think. Then they ended up sending tanks into the compound, as they called it, injecting poisonous gas that was banned under the Geneva Convention on American citizens, and killed, I think, 20-some children, 80-some overall, whatever it was. But it was a disgrace, one of the saddest chapters in American history. No one ever apologized for it. And again, the vast majority of the people sat there asleep and allowed it to happen, but there were people like us out there in the heartlands that were really incensed by it and realized America had crossed another line, another moral line. And then Oklahoma City happened, and I believe Oklahoma City was contrived by the government in response to the growing militia movement and the growing third-party movement, which we saw in Ross Perot. Ross Perot that was indicative of that third-party movement. With the Oklahoma City bombing, the third-party movement died. The militia movement died. Bill Clinton exploited it to the hilt, and if you read my chapter on it, you'll see how absurd that official story was as well. There wasn't a giant magical fertilizer bomb that blew that up. They knew it. You can go online, still on YouTube, and see the original local television coverage of the event, which talks over and over again about explosive devices found inside the building. But again, we talked about early media reporting and how it's swept into the memory hole. All that is swept into the memory hole. Luckily, we have the internet where we can still access that kind of stuff. But you try interesting any mainstream reporter in that, they're going to just scoff and you'd say, "Oh, conspiracy theories," and that's, those events were huge, and they were indicative of, again, where America was at. And unfortunately, again, too many people swallowed that story each time, and eventually, I think, again, the next thing was 9/11, and after 9/11, the government felt comfortable in really clamping down, and then we saw the Patriot Act, we saw the Homeland Security Department, we saw free speech zones, and all the awful stuff that we're still living under today.
So let's talk briefly about 9/11, and then we'll try to wrap up. That's certainly a subject that's in the realm of you're not allowed at all to question anything. If you say anything involving 9/11 without having just absolute reverence, then you're a horrible person. Why is it okay to question, especially 9/11, and what is there to question?
Well, again, there's everything to question. We're asked to believe that on September 11, 2001, that these four planes were hijacked. They were flying around. We still had the last plane the plane that hit the Pentagon, the plane in Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half total, where our government was aware that something was going on, something beyond a random hijacking was going on. If they took any action at all that day, it went unreported. They did absolutely nothing, unless they may have shot down Flight 93 over Pennsylvania and lied about it, possibly. They may have done that. But you had the last plane heading for the heart of the greatest defense establishment any country has ever built, the Pentagon, fortress, and with tons of security cameras even back then, and yet we're supposed to believe that there's no view of the plane hitting it. Nothing. We've still never seen the plane hitting the pit with all those security cameras there. And yet they can't, because of all the speculation about that the hole wasn't big enough, and there wasn't any wreckage, so something else, a missile or something had to hit. With all that speculation, this crazy conspiracy theories, how do you shut them up? Well, you produce a video. They haven't produced a video because they can't, because obviously that plane didn't hit the Pentagon. We know that before 9/11, there had never been an example of a high-rise steel frame building collapsing from fire in the history of the world. On September 11th, 3 did, the Twin Towers and Building 7, which was never hit by anything. And yet we're supposed to believe on that day they all collapsed into their own footprint, looking just like an implosion when we see a building detonated. That's exactly what it looked like. And yet since that time, no other steel frame building, and I have some examples in the book, and other people have talked about all the recent examples of buildings in other countries, steel frame buildings that burned for quite a bit of time, never collapsed. Yet we're supposed to expect that, we're supposed to believe that, they admit, they talk about jet fuel having to reach a certain temperature, and they admit that it never reached it that day, and yet they're telling you in order to melt steel, and yet they still go ahead. The scientists, just like the official historians, they still go ahead and tell you, yeah, but the jet fuel melted the steel. But you just said that it never reached a temperature enough, which your science indicates it has to reach in order to melt the steel. But they don't care about that. The narrative is that it happened, and it all becomes something like my favorite example of how you shut down debate is this one of my least favorite comedians, Dennis Leary. His brother, I think, was a firefighter or something, and he wasn't even a firefighter in New York. But I guess one of the 9/11 truthers, the name, as if that's a bad term. I mean, how is being seeking the truth a bad thing? So I proudly say I'm a truther. But somebody asked him a question about 9/11. He said, hey, man, I get all belligerent. My brother's a firefighter. Like, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Your brother's not even a firefighter in New York, and even if he was in New York, that would be completely irrelevant, because what does that have to do with? But that's the kind of emotional response we get from even celebrities, and you see this in celebrities too. The celebrities, whether it's comedians, who they make fun of, who they ridicule, they're all part of it too, whether they realize it or not. They're all propping up. I mean, look at the hatred towards Trump. Every single celebrity. I saw Bruce Springsteen. I used to love his music, but he came out, was saying these awful things about Trump, and the worst thing he could talk about when he talked about him was that, hey, he's got people talking about voting fraud. As if that's a bad thing. I mean, we clearly have voter fraud. And I'm guessing that Springsteen's first choice was probably Bernie Sanders, who was the biggest victim of vote fraud in this last campaign. But what happens is when you have exposure, now we have with people like Julian Assange, and then before you got Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden, these whistleblowers are relegated to jail, or they're isolated, they're exiled to other countries, because we want to punish the few people that are willing to step forward and expose the wrongdoing. And that's our media, too. Our media had no interest in the leaks from Julian Assange about the DNC. All they wanted to know was it Russia or Trump? They wanted to go after that instead of what was in the leaks. It exposed the fact that there was a campaign to cheat Bernie Sanders out of the nomination. They don't care about that. And that's where we're at right now. And 9/11 really said us, if we went over crossed a moral line each time, we really crossed a moral line with 9/11, because that led the way to a few years later from that, where we would start publicly advocating assassination, where we actually brag about killing people. And we've killed way too many people, and I don't know of anybody at this point in the public eye who was saying, in 1976, Gerald Ford signed an executive order banning assassination as a political tool in America. Now everyone on the left and right is fighting each other who can brag about killing people more. As Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died. I mean, that's become the official credo, and we've crossed a huge moral line with that, because we've lost any moral high ground over a third world country, anybody, when we're advocating the assassination of human beings.
All right, so we're running out of time here, but two more topics that you cover in your book that I want to very, very briefly get to, and get to where the official story is wrong on these. So if you can keep it to under a minute on each of these. But where's the official story wrong on the Gary Webb issue and all the oddball things associated with his death? And also, where's the official story wrong on the killing of Osama bin Laden?
Okay, well, on Gary Webb, all you need to know there really is that the official story is he shot himself twice in the head. That's a cute trick for anybody to do. Gary Webb and he had reported shadowy figure was following him, death threats and so forth. He told Alex Jones, he told Freeway Ricky Ross, lots of people. I know his own family accepts the fact he killed himself. I don't know how you can accept the fact somebody shot himself twice in the head. I have a lot of the details in there, and he wrote his own epitaph about how he never got into trouble until he started writing important things, and he really exposed something huge when he talked about our government being involved in importing crack into the inner cities, and they're really responsible for the crack epidemic. For Osama bin Laden, as I put in there, they originally tried to put a death picture of Osama bin Laden that was exposed on the internet as a fraud. They came up with this ridiculous story that they threw his body in the ocean because of Muslim law. That contradicts everything we know about the Muslim religion. And then of course my favorite is the picture they took in the White House Situation Room of Hillary Clinton with her hand over her mouth and Obama and everybody watching supposedly live coverage of Osama bin Laden being killed, when later they admitted there was no video of that, there was nothing in them to watch. So it was completely staged. And at this point, how would we accept anything these guys say about issues, especially with someone like Osama bin Laden, who has been used as a scapegoat for their own inside job on 9/11.
All right, so where are we right now, and what lessons, if there are one or two that you would point out, can we learn from all of this and the sorts of overriding themes that are covered in your book?
Well, I think we're in a battle right now for whether this country sinks completely down to third world status or whether we have a chance to regain what perhaps we once were. Or at least, maybe even hopefully something better than that. But the lessons I would say, especially for young people, and I do get encouraged by the amount of young people who are skeptical and question things, but at this point, there's no reason to trust the mainstream media about anything. There's literally nothing I trust them about. If they tell me it's raining outside, I would assume it's not raining. They have no credibility. And any politician, other than, like as I've said about Donald Trump, and I'm probably going to vote for him, is because of the fact that he has all the right enemies. So either this is the biggest psyop in the history of politics, or he really is a threat to the establishment, because every single facet of the establishment is lined up against him. So I look, if somebody has the right enemies, I realize maybe there's a chance. But if Trump isn't, and even if Trump's elected, it said he may turn out to be a phony, but if Hillary Clinton's elected, I think we are, and it's inevitable, we're going to become a third world nation. And a lot of people like me are kind of doomsters in a way. I think the economy is going to collapse because I don't think it can sustain itself the way we have. We have 40% of the people that have no wealth right now. Almost half the country has nothing. No jobs being created, industry gone. So unless we get somebody in there that's going to change that, I don't hold out much hope for the future. The only thing I can say, like I said, is if enough people can overcome the sheeple and wake them up and get them to realize that we can't continue on like this, and we might be able to save the country, but I'm not too optimistic.
All right. Well, what are the best ways to follow your work, and what readings or resources do you recommend someone take a look at if they want to learn more about the sorts of topics we've been discussing during this interview?
Well, like I said, obviously my own book, my next book is coming out next year called Survival of the Richest, in which I focus on the disparity of wealth especially, and the corruption of the marketplace. My blog is DonaldJeffriesWordPress.com. That's Keeping It Unreal, where you can follow my writings. I write quite a bit. On any of these topics, the best information, usually, there are not that many books out there like mine, especially that cover all these topics. The JFK assassination, there are lots and lots of really good books. I suggest the classics like Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Moore, Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane, and so forth. Most people know about those, but I tried to tie them all together. There's really nowhere else you can find information out about the JFK Jr. death in my book. But there are lots of resources. That 9/11, there aren't a whole lot of books out there, but there are tons and tons of websites. People can look at that, and they can follow, alternative media and podcasts like yours, and they can find out alternative information and realize that that they're not crazy, to suspect that something's going wrong, because we're just not going down the right path.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to encourage everybody to take a look at the show notes page for this episode. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/hidden-history. And, of course, we'll link in multiple places on there to the book we've been discussing today, which is called Hidden History, an Exposé of Modern Crimes, Conspiracies, and Cover-Ups in American Politics. And we'll also link to the Keeping It Unreal blog. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/hidden-history for all the resources and links related to this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so that you can stay up to date on what's going on with the show and make sure to catch every episode and not miss any. And Don, thank you so much for joining us today. By and large, we've tried to avoid conspiracy theory topics on the show just because there's so many things that we wanted to get, and this is still a relatively new show. But I figure, we've done about 120 episodes. It's a good time to get this in, and your book covers so many. It's so extensive and just has so much stuff in there. So I thought it would be the perfect way to introduce people to some of these ideas and to bring it up on this show for the first time pretty much. Because on this show, we do want to cover a lot of these sacred cow topics that supposedly can't be covered and can't be talked about. So your book was a great way to start with that. And thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully we can speak with you again sometime in the future.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.